It seems like everywhere I look, people are complaining about therapy speak. The overuse of therapeutic terms in everyday life is something that just appears to annoy almost everyone, regardless of their political affiliation or their broader philosophical views. And I find discussions and controversies like this fascinating, because they often cross over with some deeply interesting areas of philosophy, psychiatry, and linguistics. And by looking at therapy talk, we can gain an insight not only into this narrow field of discourse, but also the way we can deceive ourselves with language much more generally. And I just want to preface this whole thing by clarifying that I am not a psychiatrist, nor am I a therapist. And I'm not talking about those professions. I'm rather talking about the way that terminology from those professions is misused in our everyday speech, removed from its original therapeutic context or definition. That is, I'm discussing the misuse of therapeutic terminology, not the strict usage of it. This is not an anti-therapy video. And as always, take what I say here with a healthy grain of salt. I don't have the last word, nor do I ever have it. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. Words, implication, and epistemology. In order to understand why people are so irritated by the inappropriate use of therapy speak, we're going to have to slightly rethink the way that we talk about language. Namely, we're going to have to go beyond just what a word means to see what it functionally does and what implicit assumptions it brings along with it. The philosopher and linguist Paul Grice was fascinated by implicature. That is, not what a statement says, but what it communicates without explicitly stating. For instance, I am almost aggressively British, which means that if I hear someone's holiday plans and say, "Wow, you're so courageous," then there's a good chance that I think they're absolutely bonkers. The strict content of my statement is that they are brave, but within the context of the UK and with a certain tone of voice, I have implied that the plans are irresponsible or ill thought through. We won't need the details of Grice's specific theory here, though I highly recommend checking it out as it is highly interesting. But I just wanted to get us in the general headspace of thinking, what is someone doing when they say this, rather than just thinking, what does this strictly mean? There is a whole world of linguistic communication that just occurs at this implied level, and the types of things that can be implied are almost endless. You can imply particular meanings, yes, but you can also imply social status or economic class or authority or lack thereof. For example, take the following two statements. "My good fellow, you just don't understand Tolstoy," and "You ain't been reading Tolstoy that good." These statements have the same semantic content, but the first implies a certain social context, that the speaker is likely at least middle class, whereas the second implies a more precarious economic status. I'm not saying that this is good or helpful, I'm just saying that it exists. There are whole fields of sociolinguistics that are specifically looking into the details of these status or economic-based implications and how they affect how things are perceived, often in quite unfair ways, but we don't need to go into that now. The important thing is that we recognize the significance, ubiquitousness, and variety of implication. A lot more things can be implied than we might have previously thought. Okay, so now, let's narrow our focus to implications of authority. A classic example of authority-laden speech is medical speech. There is a whole vocabulary that is primarily used by medical professionals, and as a result, it implies that we are in that epistemic world and somewhat inheriting that authority, so to speak. But if you're worried about the misuse of epistemic systems in your newsfeed, then you should check out today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Each story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal. So I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on reports that President Trump is thinking of pardoning Sean Diddy Combs. Whereas left-wing sources emphasized those who talked about the potential alienating effects this could have on young female voters, right-wing sources chose to emphasize the reasoning behind the idea that Trump thought the conviction had been unfair. I especially like the blind spots feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by either the left or the right. This feed helps readers step into the other side's news reality and understand the different narratives that can shape their beliefs, such as left-wing news sources missing a dressing down given by Cory Booker to his fellow Democratic senators, or right-wing sources missing claims that Trump's name had been deliberately redacted from Epstein-related files. I just don't have a lot of time to keep up with the news, and certainly not to examine every single article I read for bias. So receiving my ground news roundup at the end of every single day means that I can get a variety of different news opinions, learn which sources to trust, and make the world less of a bewildering mess, which all help to avoid the natural cognitive biases that would lead me astray. Ground News is giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. They have genuinely become my go-to news source, and I sincerely hope that you'll check them out. But anyway, back to the video. Take the term disease. If something is called a disease, then that carries with it an implication of seriousness and authority. We rarely question whether someone has a disease if they say they do, because we assume that the proclamation has come from a medically sound source somewhere down the line. This is part of the reasoning behind us calling things like schizophrenia mental illnesses. The label illness, backed by some kind of trusted medical authority, lets us know that if this person acts incredibly erratically or even antisocially, then we certainly should not have them thrown in jail or socially ostracize them, but we should check if they are properly medicated and receiving the right care. This whole process only works because the label is borrowing the epistemic authority of the person that has bestowed it, which in this case is almost certainly a medical professional. If we all stop trusting our medical epistemic apparatus, then the word illness and the word disease would cease to have this sort of power. And to be clear, this can be a very good thing. We sometimes want to be able to signal things like epistemic authority with the labels that we use. It can be a very useful kind of informational shorthand that crams in a whole bunch of extra content without necessarily adding more words and slowing down communication. This is one reason why we legally have certain protected terms, well, protected. I can't go around calling myself a doctor because I have neither a PhD nor a medical degree. And collectively, we have decided, I think quite rightly, to safeguard the authority of the word doctor. Thus, there are laws preventing us from saying that we are doctors if we don't have the required qualifications. It's the same logic that means that you can't impersonate a police officer. We just don't want to have to check every time someone says they're a doctor that they actually are one, and so we protect the term. We call examples of people misusing these terms fraudulent because they're being deceptive by pretending to an authority that they do not in fact have. Although therapy speak is not quite the same as other medical terminology, it does carry with it some measure of this authority. And I think that quite a lot of that authority is often earned. We treat trained therapists as, effectively speaking, experts on interpreting human behavior. This assumption is what allows us to walk into a therapist's office and trust that what they say is going to be insightful and at the very least is worth taking seriously. This, of course, doesn't mean that therapists can't be wrong, but it does mean that most of us treat their word as more important than your average person when it comes to matters of the mind. And just like medical professionals, this authority is inherited by their terminology. For instance, a term that's sometimes used in therapy and incredibly popularly used in popular therapy speak is gaslighting. This is when someone manipulates someone else into thinking that they are mad or that their own perception of events cannot be trusted without any kind of epistemic warrant to do this. I say without epistemic warrant because there are some times where it's justifiable to let someone know that their perceptions are untrustworthy, say if they suffer from hallucinations. But these caveats aside, this is broadly, and again, I think correctly, seen as a deeply unhealthy pattern of behavior and a sign of abuse from the gaslighter to the gaslightee. Although this is not a term that's actually particularly widely used in the psychological literature, it has come to be associated with therapy and therapists. There is, at the very least, a public perception that gaslighting is a somewhat scientific therapeutic term that picks out a certain dynamic in the world that definitely does exist in some cases, and it is useful to have this term. So far, so good. As long as the term is being used with the correct epistemic authority behind it, then I can't see any problems emerging. But with language, as with superheroes, with great power comes great responsibility. There is a danger in using language like this outside of its proper context, because it can borrow all of that authority that we just talked about without backing it up with a solid epistemology. And this is where we encounter our first potential trouble with this loose usage of therapy talk. It presumes this epistemic authority, which is not often earned in this context. I'll give you an example to help illustrate. Imagine that you and I had a heated disagreement about something. If I were to simply describe that to someone as a heated disagreement, then I am implicitly admitting that you could be right and I could be wrong. I'm framing the situation as that of two people on roughly equal footing. But if I described it as you gaslighting me, then this is a very different framing. It suggests, right off the bat, that there is little to no chance of you being correct and me being incorrect. Moreover, it uses the aesthetics of scientific inquiry to back up my interpretation of events and place me on a moral high ground. This is even starker with terms like narcissist. If I call someone a narcissist, I am implicitly communicating not just that I am right in whatever conflict we've engaged with, but also that this is an evil person who is simply not worth listening to. And moreover, that they fall into a scientifically designated camp of bad people. It repaints what is just my interpretation of a situation, or at least potentially just my interpretation of a situation, which may or may not be any more epistemically justified than the person I'm disagreeing with, and makes it an objective truth, or makes it pretend to an objective truth. It's a little bit related to how Foucault says the term mad can be used to ostracize people from our discourse. Through a kind of philosophical smuggling process, my opinion is transformed into a scientific-seeming fact. It's a bit like when someone funds a think tank to produce a given idea so that they can then cite that idea as supported by a report from the Institute of Big Clever People with Long Beards. It's using the bells and whistles of a scientific, or at least semi-scientific process as a kind of personal propaganda machine. It makes the idea less questionable, it sometimes implies the speaker is on a moral high ground, and it certainly gestures at epistemic authority, which, in this context, may be totally unearned. So, that's that then. Therapy talk is irritating because it pretends to an authority that is unearned. But hang on. Things are much more complicated than this, because there is a further danger that we incur just with the act of labeling itself. 2. Names, distortion, and concept creep. One of the most interesting and highly unusual thinkers of the early 20th century was Alfred Korzybski. His most famous phrase is, "The map is not the territory," and he spent an awful lot of his career pointing out just how much our conceptual frames and chosen terminology can distort or otherwise just alter our view and experience of the world. One famous and possibly apocryphal story about him states that he was lecturing one day and was handing out biscuits to his students. After they'd had a few biscuits, he revealed that they were, in fact, dog biscuits, at which point the students started coughing and spluttering, and this reinforced Korzybski's point that the concepts that we use affect our direct experience of reality. When the students thought of themselves as having just eaten dog biscuits, their experience was immediately repulsive and disgusting, even though they were happily eating them just a moment ago. This anecdote also demonstrates a pretty Korzybskian point about names. We tend to think of names as a little bit like putting labels on boxes. We have a box in our head marked dog with all the dogs in it, a box marked people with all the people in it, and so on. But Korzybski argued that this image was really quite severely mistaken. This box-based picture implies that the way we label things is merely neutral. We're just applying names to pre-existing, unchanging concepts. Whereas Korzybski thought that labels could in fact, change our concepts. That is, just like with the dog biscuits, the way that we choose to name, categorize, and label things can alter our view on them, sometimes incredibly unhelpfully. So, say for the sake of argument, I was trying to campaign for the mass elimination of puppies. I obviously could not just come out and say this, so I would probably start by recording biting incidents from large, dangerous dogs. I would call these canine aggression incidents. This term sounds pretty objective, but it also carries with it a certain kind of image. If you hear that term, you probably think of a big dog biting someone. And sure, that is how the usage of the term starts out. But then, as time goes on, I start just loosening the bounds of how I use the term. I will start recording serious barking as a canine aggression incident, and then I will record quieter and quieter barks in this way by smaller and smaller dogs. And then, at long last, I would be able to point to the huge number of canine aggression incidents that I have recorded as evidence that dogs are dangerous and should be eliminated. Now, this is a pretty caricatured case, and I'm sure that we can all agree that I have misled people in how I've used language here. But why is this? Well, part of it is that my label is already distorting things in a small way. I'm taking all kinds of dog behavior and putting it under the label canine aggression incident. This abstract label conjures up a certain kind of image or prototype in people's heads, which is misleading when I then widen the bounds of the term, because when those bounds expand, the abstraction becomes more and more removed from the events on the ground, until I'm categorizing pretty not that troublesome dog behavior as aggression. It's similar to how the term enhanced interrogation was used in the early 2000s to describe what most people would just call torture. This kind of linguistic maneuver works by playing on the discrepancy between the actual state of affairs in the world and the image that is conjured up in the listener when they hear a particular term. Okay, so that's a lot of side tangent. Let's bring it back to therapy talk. So the first thing to note is that when we label a given experience using therapeutic language, this is not just neutrally labeling the experience, it's also characterizing it. Let's revisit the term narcissist. If someone behaves in a consistently selfish manner, then we may use this term to describe them. But an important change does occur when we go from describing a set of behaviors as merely selfish to describing a whole human person as narcissistic or a narcissist. We have abstracted from their behavior to them as a fixed identity. That may be appropriate in some cases, especially when this term is used in a specifically therapeutic context, as these characteristics can help predict future behavior. But importantly, they are still abstractions, and so they do have the potential to distort the situation on the ground, though obviously they won't do so in all cases. Calling someone a narcissist is just a far less fine-grained picture than describing the specific behavior that led you to make this judgment. Likewise, calling an event gaslighting is much less detailed than explaining the particulars of the gaslighting event. And in itself, this is by no means a bad thing, but it is this gap created by the abstraction that allows distortions in understanding to creep in. If we combine this potential for distortion with the thousands of people on social media who fling around the term narcissist to mean anyone they disagree with, or use gaslighting to mean someone with a different interpretation of events, or just redefine trauma, which is a narrowly defined term or relatively narrowly defined term, simply using it as a byword for harm, then we do end up with a potentially quite misrepresentative description of reality. This process doesn't require anyone to be outright dishonest. All it requires is the gradual watering down of certain terminology. And this is the first issue with therapy speak, and specifically therapeutic concept creep in everyday speech, the distorting effects it can have on our views and description of the world. But there is a second problem, and that is that with this concept creep comes the potential, again, to pathologize more and more components of human experience. Now, things get complicated here, because sometimes it is undeniably useful, especially in psychiatric contexts, to medicalize certain mental states. It can be genuinely helpful to call certain mental states as illnesses for the reasons that we discussed in the last section. It can help direct people to the help that they need. I'm not questioning any of that at all. However, some clinicians and philosophers of science in recent years have raised concerns about just how much of our lives are potentially being seen through this medicalized lens. To clarify, this is not quite the same thing as concerns about overdiagnosis, but rather the prevalence of medical and pathologizing language in how we, in everyday life, interpret our own experience. For example, in their work, The Loss of Sadness, the sociologist Alan Horwitz and the philosopher of science Jerome C. Wakefield argue that we ought to be very careful about how we categorize mental states such as depression, and in their later work, they talk about anxiety. So, to give a very potted version of their argument, and bear in mind this is highly simplified, Horowitz and Wakefield point out that sometimes extended periods of sadness, emptiness, and lack of motivation, that is, the symptoms of major depressive disorder, are entirely appropriate to a given situation. In other words, they're not dysfunctional and can't be categorized as biological dysfunctions in a medical sense. A classic example of this is grief. If I were to lose a loved one, then I would expect to feel deeply unhappy about it for a rather long time. Someone that I know sadly lost their husband a few years ago, and they still find this experience very hard, and most of us would not call that pathological. However, situations like this are not the only time where we might question the utility of a medicalizing frame to describe someone's suffering mental state. For example, let's say that someone lived in an isolated, dilapidated flat, far from anyone they knew or loved. They could not work due to persistent migraines, and they were always one financial difficulty away from being evicted and thus out on the streets. If this person is deeply unhappy all the time, or chronically anxious and stressed, is that best seen as a biological dysfunction that is individual to them? It's arguably better approached as a social problem. The issue isn't just that they're sad because of their situation, and sometimes the medicalizing lens can distort this, at least according to Horowitz and Wakefield. Part of their point is that if we start interpreting too many of our unpleasant mental states purely through the lens of individual biological dysfunction, then we could potentially miss where social or environmental factors are at play. This is not controversial among psychiatrists, but I do find that a discrepancy emerges at the level of popular speech, where these social factors can often quickly fall out of awareness in favor of a sort of simplistic psychiatric label that's often used out of context. Now, Horowitz and Wakefield have various critiques of elements of psychiatric terminology in the past 15 years or so, but we don't need to make any controversial claims about the state of established psychiatry for our purposes here. Whether or not you think that their critique applies to psychiatric practice, it is almost certainly relevant to our more casual usage of therapeutic and psychiatric terminology, where we are often distorting the relevant clinical meaning of these terms. And so what, you might think? So a few people are using words incorrectly according to you aggressively British man on my phone screen. Who cares? Well, if you're not convinced by some of the effects of concept creep that we've already discussed, here are two more potentially quite worrying consequences. The first is short-term, and the second is long-term, and neither are altogether desirable. In the short term, this concept creep can lead to particular situations being mischaracterized. If the term narcissist or gaslighting gets routinely used inappropriately, then this has the potential to make situations seem more serious and people more villainous than they actually are. Sarah Schulman has called this overstating harm, and obviously in an age of endless algorithmic competition, there is sometimes an incentive to overstate harm in this way. I'm not saying that this happens in all cases. I certainly don't think it does. I'm just saying that it is a thing that does happen, and moreover, we are incentivizing to happen. This short-term effect is facilitated because the term still has the feel of its narrow usage, while its actual usage is widening. But in the long term, this concept creep can eventually dilute the meaning of a term in genuinely serious contexts, and this is pretty undesirable if you ask me. Imagine if we started using the term murder to refer to less serious crimes like robbery. Well then, eventually, the meaning of that term would shift. And when someone heard murder, they wouldn't necessarily think of the brutal act of taking someone's life, but potentially all manner of less serious crimes. It's a bit like how the word literally now has a much wider meaning than it used to. Likewise, if our usage of therapeutic terms in everyday discourse becomes too loose, then we risk robbing people of the potential to accurately describe their own experiences and get that across to others, because we've watered down the terminology that they would use to do so. Eventually, we will stop taking labels like gaslighting or trauma seriously, but these are incredibly useful terms to describe certain situations. And as we said earlier, all of this can subtly cause us to think of all of these as necessarily individualistic phenomena when they may hint at broader social concerns. But next, I want to talk beyond merely linguistic concerns and discuss what the underlying ethical assumptions of popular therapy talk generally are. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel, or if you're feeling incredibly generous and want to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow-motion book-by-book bookshelf tour, then consider subscribing to the Patreon, though it's absolutely no pressure. The links are in the description. 3. Therapy speak and ethical presuppositions. It feels a bit strange to think of therapy as having particular values. After all, we tend to think of it as a neutral intervention, simply designed to make people better. But this idea of making people better implies a kind of ethical framework and ethical standard of a good life, which we can either measure up to or require intervention about. And these values are often carried over, and often in a caricatured form, in our popular therapy speak. In his work, Ethical Visions of Psychotherapy, the psychotherapist Kevin R. Smith argues that different types of therapy carry with them different ethical ideas as to what makes a good life. And to be clear, neither I nor Smith view this as a bad thing. He thinks that such ideas are essential for therapeutic practice to function, but he does think that we ought to be aware of them. In the opening sections of the book, he describes 3 broad ethical visions in therapy, stating their presence and balance varies between different therapists and different therapeutic practices. One camp perceives that their job as therapists is to fix abnormal symptoms in their patients. Another sees the good life as a result of self-knowledge and self-understanding, while another sees mental health issues as just as often stemming from social or environmental circumstances as biological dysfunctions. All of these approaches have different strengths and weaknesses depending on your perspective and the particular situation that you're looking at. But Smith's point is that these value systems, like so many of our value systems, often go unrecognized or are thought of by practitioners as self-evidently true. We can illustrate this point further by looking to past value systems in psychiatric or therapeutic practice that we now broadly disagree with, let's say. For example, it was only in the mid to late 20th century that homosexuality ceased to be considered an illness that could be treated with therapy in the West. And during American slavery, drapetomania was the condition of a slave wanting to run away from their bondage. Both of these were predicated on certain ideas about the good life. The first was that the good life necessitated not being gay, and the second was that, within the incredibly racist society of slavery-era America, the good life for a black person was considered one of slavery, and thus to try to rebel against that was considered a mental illness. And, not to get all woke, but I think that we can see in hindsight that these were not neutral scientific descriptors, but reflections of the particular value systems at play at the time. Value systems that we now see as deeply flawed, to say the least. And if the values involved in technical fields like psychotherapy often go unacknowledged, then you can bet that there are almost certainly some unacknowledged values in our much looser therapy talk as well. Something that Dr. Anna from Psychology with Dr. Anna mentioned in her video on therapy speak is that the overwhelming ethic of popular therapy speak is a kind of extreme individualism that insists on viewing people as isolated agents who owe nothing to one another. This has even become a phrase in many of these spaces online. You don't owe anyone anything. And hey, you might genuinely support this kind of ethical system. I would disagree with you. I think that the human is an inherently social animal and that our theory of the good life should probably reflect this if it's going to effectively guide us towards human flourishing. But I do think that there is a lot of room for sensible disagreement here. Certainly, overly collectivist visions of the good life have their downsides as well. But my point is more that this is a value judgment being made implicitly. However, because of the scientific vibe of therapy talk, this value judgment is sort of hiding behind the scenes. For example, much of our therapy speak is geared around the notion of personal autonomy, which is totally fine in and of itself. But we might take issue if this one value ends up being raised above all others, as I often find it is in popular therapy talk. I know that this is almost a parodic example, but I've even seen a few people using therapy speak around personal freedom and autonomy to justify deceiving others or cheating on their partners. The idea that jealousy or envy can never be justified or is always a sign of a personal, isolated pathology as opposed to a human experience that can be justified or unjustified in different situations. It's not a value-neutral take. It is an ethical claim about the good life that's often presented without argument. The YouTuber Galatea has a great video looking at one pretty egregious example of this if you'd like to check it out. In the first section, we talked about personal interpretations or personal opinions being smuggled into discourse as scientific facts through this loose use of therapy talk. But here we see the same phenomenon in a much more serious way, at least in my opinion. Now we have whole value systems that are being laundered as if they were totally unquestionable or simply fell out of a scientific view of the world. And it is worth noting the particular value system that popular therapy speak has settled upon, a kind of stark individualism, because there are numerous critiques from both philosophers and psychotherapists over whether this is the best way to approach personal struggles in all cases. We touched upon this in the last section with the colloquial usage of the terms anxiety and depression, but I'd like to expand upon it now because I think that it is a much bigger issue. I know that I've spoken about this on the channel before, but take the idea of burnout, which is a pretty popular subject online, and discussions around it often involve a lot of therapeutic speech that's taken out of context. People often analyze this as an issue of personal boundaries and how we just need to stand up for ourselves in workplace environments and learn to relax more. Now, this is all well and good, and I actually do think this can be very helpful advice. But I think that in its commitment to a merely individualistic perspective on things, it does somewhat ignore the wider pressures that make burnout happen for so many people. These include straightforward economic pressures such as the rising cost of living and especially in the UK, housing. But as has been pointed out by Max Weber, as well as more recently Byung-Chul Han, these pressures also include our inherited values, which often emphasize that work and personal achievement are the most important aspects of your life and form the standard by which your life and your person more generally will be judged by others. This almost certainly leads to an awful lot of work stress and eventually burnout. But it's neither an individual problem nor something that can just be solved by asserting personal boundaries. As I've argued in the past, it would require a much more collective effort to shift what we societally value. But it's very difficult to talk about this if we're just stuck in the mode of popular therapy speak with its assumption that all or almost all problems are merely individual. You can see this kind of implied ethical system in almost every facet of therapy speak online. The approach to relationships is geared around an ideal that is totally unquestioned, often that relationships should be stress-free, that two people should never have to work on their compatibility or sacrifice for one another, that prizes independence above everything else, and the concept of having a duty towards your partner is totally skimmed over or even maligned. Additionally, there is often the implicit assumption that talking about emotions using therapeutic language is always the most productive and clearest way to communicate and is a surefire marker of emotional intelligence. This ignores the fact that therapy speak can just as easily be used as a way to avoid being vulnerable with someone or even to be cruel. People have talked about weaponizing therapy speak in this way in the past. Therapy speak can often be a power play as much as clear expression, and emotional communication and understanding is not a magic spell where you can just say the right words and that means that you're the sensible and mature party in a discussion. This is a heavyweight ethical question at play. Perhaps the most insidious ethical proposition that therapy talk smuggles into discourse is that the knowledge and usage of therapeutic language is a sign of good character. This implicitly views therapeutic language as more than just one tool among many and transforms it into the only way to properly describe our mental world, to cut it at the root if you're a metaphysician about it. It takes a particular ethical stance that is controversial even among therapists and assumes that it is the sole authoritative way to talk about our minds and our experience. This is even more egregious considering that this particular individualistic ethic prevalent in popular therapy speak is not even a universal value system among trained therapists. And again, I want to reinforce that there is nothing wrong with having value systems in therapeutic or medical practice. It may even be unavoidable. Values have been a part of the practice ever since Hippocrates declared that the duty of a medical professional was to help the patient and not harm the patient. That is still an ethical proposition. The issue is that the concept of there being underlying ethical conceptions of the good life at work in therapeutic practice is often totally elided when it comes to popular therapy speak, even though it is acknowledged by an awful lot of therapists. This both muddies the philosophical waters and allows people to present a particular ethical framework as unquestionably and objectively correct in all circumstances under the guise of this merely being the scientific view on things. But now I want to broaden our scope, because the phenomena that we've been talking about stretch far beyond simply therapy speak, and it is worth taking note of where else they might be applicable. 4. The power of language. The idea of newspeak is one of George Orwell's most sensationalized concepts. It comes from his novel 1984 and is the ruling party's attempt to use a controlled language to control not just what the population can say, but even what they can coherently think about. Luckily, there is increasing empirical evidence that such an extreme dystopian use of language, where what people can even think is hard limited by the language in question, is likely not possible. However, this intuition that Orwell was tapping into, that how we describe, categorize, and frame ideas is incredibly important, is certainly worth listening to. And today, we've looked at just a few ways that language can affect how we approach and interpret and categorize situations. We've used the example of therapy speak, but if we look more closely, each of our observations apply to far wider and arguably far more important topics. Firstly, it's not just therapy speak that brings with it a certain epistemic authority that may be unearned. We see this an awful lot with scientific language more generally, or statistical language. For example, there are a number of dubious books and courses that I've come across that use the word quantum in the title in a way that just isn't connected at all with the physical theories that are implied to be related to it. Statistical language can be used even more subtly because you don't even necessarily need to misuse terms. You can just leave important information out and trust that anyone without a background in statistics won't notice the difference. You can cite a study with an unrepresentatively small sample without revealing this fact. You can refer to just average values without talking about the standard deviation or even the distribution of the values, all of which are borderline essential for interpreting what that average actually means out in the world. If I told you that the average net worth of a room was £5 million, then that sounds like a room of incredibly wealthy people until I revealed that it was a billionaire doing a publicity stunt at a food bank. I have misrepresented the situation by leaving out crucial statistical information. But the selective use of statistics makes it seem like I've given you a clear, complete, and unquestionable interpretation of events. Part of the reason this works is through the very same mechanism that therapy speak can mislead people into thinking that certain interpretations of situations are unquestionably objective. It takes on board the aesthetics of an epistemically rigorous process and borrows the trust that we've already placed in that. I'd mentioned previously the phenomenon of paying motivated researchers to come to a particular conclusion and then reporting the findings of that conclusion that you've already paid for. It's worth being on guard against the aesthetics of a sound epistemic process because our good faith can be taken advantage of. Secondly, the distorting potential of abstraction is by no means limited to therapy speak. I'd already mentioned the example of enhanced interrogation, meaning basically torture, but we could just as easily point to terms like pacification or peacemaking, both of which have been used in the past to just be nice ways of saying killing lots of people. This phenomenon arguably stretches as far back as the Roman Empire, where Calgarcus the Caledonian said the following, as reported by the Roman historian Tacitus. To robbery, slaughter, plunder, they give the lying name of empire. They make a desert and call it peace. And just like my example of wanting to eliminate all puppies, this abstract terminology can be used deliberately to hide a more nefarious purpose. It's much easier to hate an abstract concept than people that you recognize as feeling and thinking beings. We talk an awful lot about the concept of dehumanization in rhetoric and how that has the potential to be undesirable. But part of the process by which this often occurs is by using the gaps in understanding that are facilitated by abstraction. Cases like therapy talk remind us just how large a gulf can emerge between the way something is described, as represented by abstract terminology if we interpreted it in a strict fashion, and the state of affairs that then exists on the ground that's being described by that language. This is certainly not to say that abstract terms are never useful. I think they can be incredibly useful. But this is always a semantic risk that we run by using them. And if we don't recognize this risk, then we run the extra risk of being deceived by a well-placed abstraction. The same goes for the process of smuggling in values in seemingly value-neutral discourse. This is especially the case where, like in therapy speak, a concept from a particular scientific or medical context creeps into a wider one. A good example of this is health. Regardless of whether you think the concept of merely physical health is totally biological, or whether you think there is an element of construction in our definition of dysfunction here as well, an ethic is undeniably implied when we use the term health in much wider contexts. For example, the idea of a healthy relationship or a healthy work-life balance often take place within particular ethical frameworks of what makes a good relationship or a good relationship with work. I am not against ethical propositions. Of course I'm not. I run a philosophy channel. However, when we start smuggling in these ethical valuations as if they were merely neutral observations, this denies us the ability to question, challenge, or otherwise just philosophically interrogate the underlying ethics behind these claims. It's so easy for this sort of thing to happen, considering that we often consider the ethical system that we've grown up with and that we use in our everyday lives just as self-evidently true. So, what do all of these things have in common? They're taking something that either reflects a philosophically debatable position, like an ethical stance, or a personal interpretation of events, and that's being dressed up as unquestionable and totally objective by borrowing the framing of a more objective-seeming context. It's taking a particular perspective and attempting to hide the hand and point of view of the author. And I hope I've demonstrated that this does really matter. It's not just pedantry, and it's not just for therapy talk, but for all kinds of areas of life, like how we talk about conflict or statistical reporting or politics or relationships or scientific findings. That doesn't mean that everything is radically subjective or that reliable knowledge is a myth. I don't think that at all. It just means that there is an incentive to make genuinely perspectival things seem more objective than they actually are, and that there are numerous linguistic tricks that allow people to do this. Just as we should be aware of propaganda strategies that aim to manipulate our emotions, we should be aware of the ways abstraction, concept creep, and disguising ethical propositions can encourage us to accept ideas uncritically or see things as more absolute and objective than they are. Whether it's therapy talk or political campaigning or scientific reporting or just news articles, it's worth knowing the tools that trick us so that we can think just a little bit more philosophically about the information that we take in. But if you want to watch more on statements that we might want to scrutinize further, then you should check out my video on pseudo-profound BS right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.